Hello everyone and welcome back to another podcast. Today we are going to be looking at the Middle Ages or medieval times depending on how you say it. We're going to be looking at life and death during this 1000-year era. So strap in because it's a bit of a hefty chapter, but it's an enjoyable chapter. So to start off, we need to examine that we are looking at life during the Middle Ages and death during the Middle Ages. And these are two key terms because usually when you get a question, half of it is about life and half of it is about death. Okay? So that is really important to know. The Middle Ages took place between 500 AD and 1500 AD. So it was a long 1000-year era. Life was set up with the feudal system, and this is how life was organized. So if you imagine a pyramid, at the top is the king. The king is in charge of everyone, and he takes about a third to a quarter of the land just for himself, for his castle, for his stables, all that type of stuff. Next in the pyramid is his vassals. Now his vassals are the people that do the work for him. He'll tell them to do something and then they'll go do it. So for this we have bishops, earls, and other noble men, okay? Next, we have the knights. So the knights would protect the land, and if they were a good knight and if they saved up money, they could also own a portion of the land themselves, but this wasn't all that common. So knights we will talk about a little bit later, but they were the next. The knights then were in charge of the peasants. And the peasants, this is a big group, and this is a group you can get asked on an awful lot, so we're going to examine these people separately. So the first of these kinds is a serf. Now a serf is very important because this person was very limited in what they could do in life. They couldn't marry freely without the permission of their lord of their land. They couldn't travel freely. They couldn't earn a wage. Altogether, life was very limited for a serf, and this was kind of considered the lowest of the low in the feudal system. The next is the free man. Now the free man could travel and he could marry as he wished, but he had to pay a little bit of rent on the land, therefore he earned a small wage. Now not enough to live on, but a small enough wage that he would be considered free. And we're going to come back to how this free man became a free man. So houses for all these people were quite simple. There was one room usually with a fire pit in the middle. During the winter they would bring the animals in to keep them warm. The houses were made out of wattle and daub, which is sticks all lined up in a row, and then you would get more bendy sticks and weave them in and out of the standing tall ones. And then the daub would be mud plastered down in the middle to create a wall, and then sometimes you would line the wall up with sticks again to kind of create a nice tight seal, or you would use leaves, whichever was more readily available. Clothes were made out of linen and wool, and they had a very basic diet. There was no real meat for poor people. They had bread and ale, porridge, oats. If you were richer, so if you were an earl or a bishop, or especially the king, you would eat meat, but you would also still have your bread and ale. So other than working in fields and everyday life, you would also have days off such as Sunday, because this was considered a holy time. So the spread of Christianity was during this era, and therefore church became a very big thing on Sundays. As well as that, people also had hobbies such as singing, wrestling, playing games such as checkers or draughts, X's and O's. Chess was also started to be invented around this time, and another sport invented at this time was football. One of my favourite facts about this time was football wasn't just played on a pitch, it was played between two neighbouring parishes. And the rules of the game there were no rules. So anything was allowed. Gouging, kicking, biting, spitting. And you would have a football, which wasn't a ball at the time, but it was either a cow's head or a pig's head, stuffed and then sewn together, and then you would kick it across to the other parish. So this game could go on for 10, 20 kilometres, and the games could go on for days. And the first team to get the ball into the neighbouring parish or neighbouring town would win. And this was how football began before, obviously, it became the Champions League and Premier League. Now, because the majority of people were very poor, this then led to a lot of crime. Now, because of a lot of people being poor at this time, crime was very rampant. There was all over the place. So a very common punishment for crime was that you would be put in a stocks and you would have rotten food thrown at you, you would have to pay a fine, or if you were running from the law, you could hide in a church. So hiding in a church was considered sacred ground, and police at the time, guards, knights, they couldn't come in and grab you because this would be going against the religion. So a lot of people would actually hide in the church. And this is where a freeman comes in. So if a serf, who is that person that can't travel, can't marry, is very poor, runs away from his land for a year and a day, he could become a free man. Now, there is that loophole that you do have to go back and declare yourself and be like, I'm free now, and therefore you might be captured and killed. But if we ignore that, a lot of these serfs ended up actually hiding out in a church, and they would help out around the church, and they would hide there for a year and a day before becoming free. Other punishments included thieves would lose their hands, people would get hanged. Sometimes if you were considered a liar or a person that talked too much, there would be this contraption that was like a mask, and a metal piece would go in and hold your tongue down in your mouth, so that way you couldn't talk. As you can guess, that was mainly given to women. But the Middle Ages also brought us witchcraft, or alleged witchcraft. So women, mainly women all the time, who were considered to be witches, there was many different tests. One of them would be that they would get tied up and thrown into a river. If they sank and drowned, they would be considered human and therefore exonerated of all their crimes, but they would be dead. Then, on the other hand, if they floated, well, then obviously they're a witch, so they would be burned at the stake. So either way, it was a lose-lose situation. The main source of income at this time was farming. Farming was constructed through the open field system, which was either 3 or 4 fields, and every year they would rotate crops through the system known as crop rotation, where a different crop was planted in every field on a different time of the year. One field was always left empty, which is called leaving it fallow meaning empty, and this was to replenish the nutrients in the soil, so that way you weren't sucking the soil dry, and therefore the field would become unusable. Now, we've spoken about how poor people live, but rich people, on the other hand, lived in very nice houses. In the beginning of the Middle Ages, rich people lived in what was known as a motte and a bailey. So the bailey was the courtyard, and then the motte was known as the hill that the nice house or the wooden castle would be upon. Now, the problem with this was, even though a moat would be dug around the motte, it was still very easy for people to attack this place. And because it was made of wood, well, you could burn it. So a lot of people ended up dying, and people thought, we need a new way to live. So what's better than wood but stone, as we learned from the 3 Little Pigs. So stone castles began being used, and you still had your bailey, which was your courtyard, and the motte was now the big stone castle. So this changed to protect people. You had better defenses, and because of that, people needed to create new weapons to lay siege on the castle. So this is a part of the chapter where you do need to know at least 3 siege weapons, because you can get asked their function. So whether it's a siege tower for climbing the wall, a battering ram for opening the gate, digging tunnels, a catapult, whatever you feel like you want to learn, you need to know at least 3. So that is all of the life part of the chapter. Now we need to look at death. So death came about through bad hygiene. A lot of people ended up getting sick. So if you imagine, they didn't have proper streets or anything, so people were walking through mud, but that mud was mixed in with animal feces. As well as that, they didn't have proper toilet systems, so people would go in the bucket and then they would throw the bucket out the window. Not the physical bucket, but the contents of the bucket. So you were walking in human and animal feces all the time. As well as that, people didn't clean, they didn't wash their hands, so people ended up getting very sick. And as such, people needed doctors. So one profession that became known as the doctors was actually a barber's. So you could go to a barber's at the time for both a haircut and a GP consultation. And a fun fact about this is, if you go to a barber's, you usually see a red and white pole outside. This became the symbol of a barber because at the time they would reuse bandages. So they would use a bandage and then they would wash it, but obviously the blood would have stained it. So then they would leave it outside on a pole wrapped around the pole to dry, and the pole would be mixed with red and white colours, and this is why a barber has a red and white pole. So doctors used all different types of techniques, such as herbs for healing, cupping like they do today, where they get a hot cup and they put it on the surface of the skin to cup and hopefully drag out any of the infections. They would amputate a limb if necessary, although most of the time it wasn't. They would use leeches and put that on the skin to hopefully drag out the infections, but of course leeches themselves contain disease. And because of all this poor hygiene, this led to what was known as the Black Death. So the Black Death is the big case study in this chapter. It came in the middle of the 1300s, and it came rats on ships. Now the rats weren't the actual problem, but the fleas on the rats. And these fleas would then jump off the rats and onto people. And because people were so dirty, so the fleas were having an absolute amazing time on people's skin. They were biting away and chewing away, therefore leading to a very contagious disease that became known as the Black Death. So symptoms of this was swelling of the skin into boils. The boils would then ooze pus. I know, lovely to think about. And it was very, very contagious. As well as that, your skin would turn this like purple black colour, which is why it became known as the Black Death. Now, mixed with the poor hygiene and the fact that this was very contagious, over a third of the population of Europe died within this time. And the peak years were between 1347 and 1350. So just some key facts, because this is usually a question that does come up. It's a nice question to answer though, and it's a very interesting one. You can find loads of videos online. I know Horrible Histories have a very nice song about the Black Death. It's very catchy if you want to do a bit of revision that way. But there we go, we have finished the Middle Ages. That's 1,000 years of history, all finished within 12 minutes. Well done, everyone. Hopefully now I will see you in another podcast, but until then, bye.